Running a small data center uses about the same amount of electricity as powering over 400 US homes. But why data centers needs this much electricity to begin with? Hey guys, in this tutorial, I'm back with another Vox style breakdown. We're going to be creating this specific scene and I'm going to walk you through the research, assets, and the process behind it. Make sure to stick till the end for an extra project breakdown. So with all that said, let's begin. So the video that inspired me was this piece on Can Clean Energy Handle the AI Boom? It's a very nice informative video with some pretty cool motion graphics. Do check it from the video description down below. Now let's talk about the assets. For this project I needed these basic structures which were made using these basic shapes. I made them in Photoshop, and for this wall structure it's actually separated into two different shapes. Now once done, you can save them as a PSD file and import it in a comp in After Effects, or save it separately as PNG. I saved them as separated PNGs. Then I found this image and basically cut out a whole bunch of these houses from it. Now some of them wasn't matching the angle perfectly, so I used different transform and distortion method to match it as close as I can. Again, it's not perfect, but this will do. Other than these, I also have some additional textures and images which I made mixing different pictures. We're gonna be using all of this in this tutorial. So this basically concludes our asset management. Now let's go to After Effects and see how it was made. So in After Effects, I have imported all of these assets. The first thing I did was created a new 1920 by 1080p comp and renamed it to Data Center. I dragged in our front and back wall inside it. Now our assets are quite dark, so I hit Ctrl K to open up the comp settings and change the background color so we can see everything better. And this background color doesn't render, it's just to see. After this, I created a new solid layer. The color really doesn't matter, and I added the fractal noise effect. In the fractal noise settings, I set the fractal type to max and the noise type to linear. Then I set the complexity down to 1. I opened up the transform properties and uncheck uniform scaling and set the height to 3600. Then I alt click on the evolution stopwatch and added the time expression, time times 100. This gives us this flowy curtain looking fractal. After this, I added the tritone effect by going Effects, Color Correction, Tritone. In the tritone effect, I set the midtone to this bright yellow color, the highlight to this dark yellow brown, and for the shadows even more darker hue. Then I added the mosaic effect by going Effects, Stylize, Mosaic. In this effect, I set the horizontal blocks to 30 and vertical blocks to 15. After a RAM preview, you can see how it creates these nice lines with different blocks moving through. Now we need to map this solid layer over our walls. We can do a track matte, but that will mess up our perspective of the blocks. So instead, we're going to be using the power pin effect to pin this over our walls. So I hit Ctrl R to bring out our rulers and started adding them around the corners of the walls. Once done, I turned on our fractal noise layer and lowered down the opacity so we can see through it. Then I added the power pin effect by going Effect, Distort, CC Power Pin. I basically snapped the points to each of the corner, then duplicated this layer and readjusted their points again. Made sure to turn the opacity for both of the layers to 100%, and after a RAM preview, this is what we got. After this, it was time to animate the data block. I dragged it into this composition and then pre-comped it into its own comp. I went inside it and started drawing this stroke. After this, I opened up the stroke properties and changed the line cap to round cap. Then I opened up the dash property, click on the plus sign to add a dash and offset. Then I hit it again to add a gap. So for the dash, I turned it down to 0, the gap to 40 and left the offset to 0. Now if we take a RAM preview, you can see the balls aren't moving because there isn't any animation over the stroke. So to do that, I selected the layer, went to add and added the wiggle path operator. In the wiggle path, I changed the details to 50 and wiggle per second to 10. Now you can see how they are wiggling around. After this, I duplicated this layer and offsetted the path. In the end, the balls were looking a bit big, so I changed all the layer stroke value to 12. Now the animation looks pretty fast and smooth. I wanted that low frame rate look. For that, I added an adjustment layer, then add the posterized time effect and set it to 6. Now you can see how the balls have this jittery look to them. Back in the data center comp, I selected our data block comp, then resized it to fit it in. Then I put it in between the walls. Now it was time to animate the data blocks. But before that, I drew this shape layer stroke as a guide for our data blocks. Again, it's not 100% accurate, but it's close enough. Make sure to turn this layer off before rendering. Then I selected all the layers and parented it to our back wall layer. I animated this wall scale, easy ease them, and then went into the graph editor and created this slight curve so it scales up fast then settles down. Then I duplicated the data block twice, then selected the bottom two and parented them to the top one. After this, I animated their position so they get separated within the walls. Once happy, I selected the keyframes, easy ease them and gave them the same treatment as before. Once done, I offsetted the bottom two comps keyframe around 3 frames, and after a RAM preview, this is our data center done. Now it was time to create the base. I made another 1080p comp and named it base, then dragged in our data center comp and used the wall as a reference to draw the base with a shape layer. Then I dragged in this paper texture and used the preserve transparency button to add it to the base. After this, I animated the paper's rotation with a time expression, then threw in a tint effect to change its color. And this is our base comp done. Before moving into the next scene, I realized I forgot to darken off the side walls, just like the example. So I quickly went back to our data center comp, then added a curve effect to one of the side walls and darken it up a bit. I created another new 1080p comp and named it final build. I dragged in our data center and base comp inside it. Then I basically repositioned and rescaled them. Once happy, I animated the base comp scale, then gave it the same speed curve treatment. After that, I just offsetted the data center comp a few frames, so it starts a bit late. I also parented the base to the data center comp. After this, I dragged in our voiceover inside this comp so we can sync up our animation. Then I animated the data center comp scale value like before. I dragged in our house images, then scaled them down. I added a tint and carve effect to one of them, then copy pasted these effects to the other houses. Then I basically started duplicating and scattering the houses around our comp. Once happy, I animated their position so they come closer to the data center from outside. I selected all the keys, then easy ease them, went to the graph editor and used the same speed graph influence like before. I trimmed all the house layers to the point when their animation starts. Then I started offsetting each house layer by just few frames. Now that we have this animation ready, the next part was the houses going down and the data center shifts to the left side. For that, I created a null and parented all the house layers to it, then animated its position going down, so all the houses go down with it. Again, with the same easy ease keyframes and the same speed graph influence. After this, I animated the data center shifting to the left in the same way and keeping it relative to our houses going down animation. Now it was time to animate those text layers you saw. For that, I created a new 800 by 400 comp and renamed it data center. Then I created a text layer and centered it. After this, I dropped this grungy texture over it and used the preserve transparency button to add it. I threw in a tint effect and a curve to add a bit more contrasty grunge to this layer. Then I animated the texture's position and then turned the keyframes into hold keyframes and looped them using the loop out expression. After that, I just duplicated this comp in the project panel and changed the text inside for each of them. I also made this equal to symbol along with the text comps. After this, I made a 400 by 400 comp, then dragged in our lightning symbol inside it and scaled it down a bit. Then I dragged in the paper texture and animated its rotation with a simple time expression again. I made a circular mask around it and centered it. Then I threw in a tint effect and swapped the colors. I recolored our symbol with a fill effect, then started animating its scale. I created a nice pop-up scale animation, then went to the speed graph editor and made sure it starts fast but stays slow in the middle and then settles down fast again. And this is how the symbol was animated. Back in the final build comp, I dragged the data center comp and repositioned it. I animated its position coming down, eased the keyframes, and used the same speed graph influence. After this, I trimmed a few frames of this comp so we don't see it coming down from all the way up. It just falls down, like all of a sudden. I basically animated all the rest of the text comps like that. I only animated the equal to comp scale value and that's it. The last thing was the symbol, so I dropped it in and then repositioned it and animated its scale. So this is our full comp almost done. We just need to add the background and a few more finishing touches. Now for the background. I added my BG texture behind it. Then I created a new solid layer and added the grid effect. I changed the size from to width slider and set the width around 57 and set the border to 3. Then I added the roughen edges and set the border to 0 and the scale to 10. This just adds a bit more roughen look to the grid. I added a turbulent displace effect and set the amount to 5 and the size to 15. Then I animated the evolution using the time expression. This will create this wobbly distortion all over the grid. Then I dropped in the grunge texture and added the tint effect, set the blending mode to multiply and added the curve effect and boosted the contrast high. I set the opacity to 50 and animated its position, then changed the keyframes to hold frames and looped them. After this, I duplicated this texture again and resetted all the effects. In the tint, I swapped the colors and then I started pulling the RGB curve down to create a high contrast. Finally, I set the blending mode to screen and that leaves us with this white specks over the comp. Also, made sure to turn the opacity down to 50 so it's not too harsh. My usual sets of effects were applied after this, some noise and a posterized time effect set to 12. And that's it. After a RAM preview, this is our final version. As you can see, if you break the elements into different categories, it's really not that difficult to make. As a matter of fact, once this scene was done, I was experimenting with a couple of different elements and I end up making this new scene. So let's quickly go through this extra project file. So here in this project file, you can see how this scene is getting animated. A majority of the elements are same as before. There are just a few new things added to this. The first one are these solar panel things, which are really simple to make, and you can see how they're scaling up. So if I open up their properties, you can see I just animated their scale and then I duplicated a whole bunch of them and basically offsetted them. And if I go inside this composition, you can see it is consist of a few basic shapes, and there is another yellow line that's going through, and it's basically track matted to that panel board from the previous one, and that's how this thing is getting animated. And on the very top there's this grid line sort of thing to give it a more structure, and that's all to it. So really simple stuff here. Another thing, we can go back to the final one and check are these windmills. And if I open up the windmill composition, again it's fairly simple, and if I solo this one, you can see this is how the body of the windmill was made. I used an actual windmill picture and cropped some texture over it, and yeah, not a really great work, but depending on this size, it's really small, so it really doesn't matter. And as for the blades, same things. I just slapped a texture over it and tried to match it as best I could. And again, pretty shorty work, I would say, but how the perspective and the size is, it really doesn't matter because they're like really small size. And if I open up the blade one, you can see it has a rotation expression, which is time times 50. So that makes it rotate throughout the composition. And finally, all over it, to color correct it, I have this simple adjustment layer with a tint effect. And that's all to this one. Again, in the main composition, this has been duplicated a couple more times. And like the solar panel, it's just scaled up. And that's it. That's how this thing was done. The next thing would be this line. Again, fairly simple. It's a shape layer stroke, which is animated using the trim paths. And if I open up the properties, you can see it's just a simple stroke. Again, I added like dash, gap and offset. And then if I go down here to the trim path option, you can see the end is animated and the offset has this time expression, so it like keeps on moving on the same direction. It's basically offsetting the path over and over, but with the dash and gap and offset effect applied over it, it shows that these balls are moving through that line. So that's basically it. I mean, there is not much more to add to it. We have this sun composition, which is, if you remember in the previous one breakdown I showed, it's basically the same as the symbol. So if I go inside it, it's just a shape layer which is rotating and a newspaper just, multiplied over it with the preserve transparency button and tinted with a color. That's it. And in the final one, this is how it's like affecting this composition. It's just a simple position keyframe, nothing fancy there. And then I duplicated this one. I believe it's set on hard light with a Gaussian blur, and that just adds this nice blurry glow to it. If I turn it off, you can see how it's reacting. And I think it's done. A majority of the things, as I said, are coming back from the previous tutorial. Sorry, not the previous tutorial, in this tutorial, but in the previous segment that I already explained. So yeah, this pretty much concludes this part. So this brings us to the end of the tutorial. I hope you liked it. I'm including both of these scenes in the project file so you guys can check them out. Now, if you want to see more Vox style videos, click on your right for that Vox playlist. Like, comment and subscribe to the channel for more motion graphics content. Take care of yourself and I'll be seeing you in the next one. Bye guys.